this is Megan Mitchell, and today we will be going over defense mechanisms. There will be defense mechanisms on both the master's and the clinical licensing exam, and there are a lot of them to remember, and today we are going to go through some of the big ones that you will see. This list is not exhaustive, but there are many that might come up on the test. We are going to see what they are and how they manifest, including examples. And then at the end, we will have 5 or 6 practice questions that you can apply to test your knowledge on defense mechanisms. So when studying defense mechanisms, there's a lot to study. And in order for this information to really stick with you, you need to come up with your own examples for each. Coming up with your own examples and being able to tell examples to someone else, that's going to really help you memorize the material. And it's going to be easier to retrieve from your memory on test day when you go and you are tested on different defense mechanisms. So for defense mechanisms, another tip is just memorizing the definitions is not going to be enough. You need to be able to apply the information you've learned from those defense mechanisms to be able to answer practice questions. So for these, I say definitely take a look at them, come up with your own examples, and be able to answer practice questions in real life scenarios. So what is a defense mechanism? So a defense mechanism is something that is used to protect oneself from unpleasant or anxiety-provoking feelings or thoughts. It's really an unconscious reaction that we do to protect ourselves. We might not even be aware that we're using these defense mechanisms. So as we go through them, you might say, wow, I really know a person that uses this a lot. That's because as human beings, we are using defense mechanisms all the time. And that's because we as humans, we don't want to feel unpleasant. We don't want to feel unhappy. We don't want to feel anxiety. So that's what these defense mechanisms are. And the big key here is that these are unconscious. We don't consciously choose to do these different things. It's a way of protecting ourselves. And the idea of defense mechanisms first came from Freud, and then actually his daughter, Anna Freud, took it a little bit farther, and this kind of became her area of study. So she is the one that really studied this into further detail from her work with patients and clients. So the first defense mechanism is compensation, and this is when a person or an individual makes up for a real or perceived weakness. An example of compensation is when someone who might be having troubles at home with their marriage, at work, they might be working long hours and really putting in the time to go above and beyond so they can excel. So you're making up for this weakness that you have at home by putting your energy and your effort into something else. Someone else asked me a question when studying this, and they said, would knowing that you're overeating so you compensate by exercising more? Absolutely, that is a defense mechanism. Another example of compensation might be that you feel anxiety or stress about this upcoming licensing exam. So what you're doing is you might be studying, spending all of your time studying, so you're compensating for a real or perceived weakness that you might have in material. So it's important to note that with defense mechanisms, they're not all negative. There's some that are actually healthy and are protective of us. So if you hear defense mechanism, it's not automatically negative. Then we have conversion, and conversion is really talking about body reactions. It might be when an event occurred, and in order to repress it or deal with it, we are expressing this in different ways through our body functions. So an example might be someone who is unprepared for a test, wakes up the day of that test, and they feel physically ill, they're nauseous, and they have a headache. When you see conversion, you want to remember that it is some sort of physical reaction within the body. Another example might be a client that has been abused for several years. They come in to see you and they say, I have paralysis of my hands. That would be a bodily function that they have in response to a certain event. So The key thing that you want to look out for in conversion are those bodily functions and things going on in the body. They might manifest as physical symptoms. Denial. This one is very common and pretty self-explanatory, but this is when we block events out of our awareness, out of our conscious. We deny actions or feelings, and we do not admit that something happened. So we just flat out are denying that it ever happened or that we were ever participating in it. An example that comes up frequently is high school students, kids often deny things. The example here is a student is caught cheating on a test. The teacher saw it, it happened, and when confronted, the student says, I never was cheating, and is adamant that he did not do it. So just denying those actions or those feelings. Another example of denial may be a person that has a terminal illness, and when the doctor's, saying, what have you done to combat these symptoms or deal with these symptoms? And they're like, I don't have high blood pressure. They just flat out are denying that it even exists. The next is disassociation, and this is a very interesting defense mechanism, and it's almost as if the person has a momentary loss of connection to the world or to reality. They may explain that they're having like a sort of out-of-body experience, or they're feeling that they are separated from themselves or from the moment or from reality. An example here is someone gets in an auto accident, so they've been involved in a car crash, and the next day they are asked about it and they have no recollection of the event. It's almost as if they have amnesia, no recollection, as if the event never happened. So this is one I want to spend a little bit of time on. Displacement versus projection. And I tutor many people taking this exam, and this seems to always be the hardest ones to differentiate between. So displacement. This is when there's a transfer of negative or unwanted emotion from one person to an unrelated person or feeling. So there are many examples of this, but the one that I have chosen is you're having a bad day at work, you come home from work and you lash out on your wife and your children. They had nothing to do with your bad day at work, but you're displacing that anger, that frustration onto them. Another very obvious example of this would be displacement, and you may see this in your studies. I remember it from when I was studying, is that someone had a bad day at work or had pent-up anger from work, comes home and is kicking his dog or abusing the dog. He's displacing that anger onto the dog. The dog did nothing wrong, unrelated to the event at work. So displacement is taking that anger and putting it or channeling it into something completely unrelated. Then we have projection. And projection is when you have thoughts, beliefs, or feelings and you project it onto someone else. An example of this is you have trouble with alcohol, you have a drinking problem, and then if your wife confronts you about it, you suggest that really she is the one that is struggling with her drinking. So you're projecting that struggle with alcohol onto your wife. Another example of projection is say that you have a client who comes in and you are very calm, you're using a calming voice, and you say, it seems like you're really upset to the client, and the client says, I'm not upset, you're upset. That client would be projecting their feelings or their anger onto you. So it's really taking what they're feeling and putting it, giving it to someone else. So those can be tricky. Remember, displacement is transferring those negative thoughts, those emotions onto an unrelated thing or person, whereas projection is projecting, giving your beliefs and putting it onto someone else. So these are ones that I really think that are important, that you take some time to dive into and come up with some examples on your own, because they can be tricky to decipher between on the exam. Identification with aggressor. This is when someone has been a victim of aggression or a victim of some sort of power differential, and that victim's taking on the role of the aggressor and imitating the behavior. Very, very common in cycle of abuse. The example that I have here is a child is being abused by their father, comes to school, and is physically aggressive to other students. That child is taking on the role of the aggressor, imitating the behavior that is put onto him. Very, very, very common. An example of this also can be if someone was bullied and then they become the bully themselves and are expressing that same behavior that was done to them. So that is identification with aggressor. Introjection, this is an interesting one. And this is when a person accepts someone's attitudes, beliefs, or values as their own. And this can be especially those beliefs, traits, characteristics that they find desirable. So this sounds a little tricky, but I think an example would be helpful. The example is a teenager buys all name brand clothes because they perceive all the popular kids wear designer clothes. So this teenager is accepting the beliefs of other people and using them as their own. Introjection is used a lot in adolescence because you have to remember that's that time of peer pressure and you want to do what your friends are doing. So that makes sense that you would be taking on another person's attitudes or beliefs. Another example is what I have seen is that a child, he gets upset but he says, I can't cry because my dad told me that it's weak for little boys to cry. So that's a value that his father has. He's taking that to now be his own personal value or belief. So that would be the defense mechanism would be introjection. Isolation of affect. This is very much what it sounds like. You are isolating emotions. That's an easier way to remember it. So this is when you might have feelings due to a traumatic or a painful event, and you are separating the emotion out of that. However, the big thing I want you to know with isolation of affect is that you do accept that this event happened. Whereas with denial, you are not even taking account that this happened, even though in reality it did. With isolation of affect, you do accept that it happens. It's just you are isolating your emotion from it. An example here is someone got in a car crash, and the example is I should be upset that I wrecked my car on the way here, but I don't really care. That would be pretty alarming if someone came to you and they just got in a big car wreck and there was no emotion and they're like, I don't really care. They're taking the emotion out of that. And for some people, this is a coping mechanism that they use. And this might be, another example might be if someone has lost a very close loved one and they come to you and they just say, I lost two parents this week in a car accident. And they're not crying, they're not overly upset. For them, they are isolating that emotion, and that what the defense mechanism they're using is isolation of affect. They are accepting that the thing happened, but really removing the emotion out of that. Then we have rationalization. This is a very, very common one that I'm sure you could come up with a million examples for. This is when we try and provide an explanation that makes sense to justify our actions. This is because oftentimes failures or deficiencies are seen as a threat to our ego. So we pick elements of the truth and deny others. Someone said to me, is rationalization kind of like making excuses? In a way. The example I have here for rationalization is I would have won the race, but the track was wet and I didn't try that hard. So in order to make yourself feel better, you're saying, well, I wasn't really trying that hard. The conditions weren't good. That's why I didn't win the race. Another example of rationalization is if you did not get a job and your rationalization was, I didn't really want that job anyways. It was my last pick. So you're kind of seeing that was a threat to your ego. So you're picking elements and finding an explanation to justify why you did not get the job. Reaction formation. So reaction formation is when you express the opposite of the way you're feeling. And by express, I mean that you are having outward behaviors that are in complete opposite of the way you're feeling. So this would be behaving or reacting the opposite of what you're intending to do. An example here is a woman comes to you in a therapy session and she says, I really cannot stand my sister. I hate being around her. I'm in a bad mood. I just despise her. But then in the same breath, she says, but you know, it was her birthday, so I got her a best sister ever card. So this client's actions would be completely opposite of the way she's feeling. She's feeling anger, disgust, not feeling positive about her sister, but her actions would be completely opposite, showing that she really thinks her sister's wonderful and all of that. Regression. So regression is really interesting because this is when someone is functioning normally and then they revert to an early developmental stage. And the reverting to an early developmental stage is when they're faced with a stressful event, they're in danger, they're threatened. And an example of this is there's a million of examples out there, but one that I like to think about is a college student who is stressed about upcoming finals begins wetting the bed at night. So the regression here is that they're, starting to go back to a much, much earlier developmental stage that has been mastered. And that is because they are very, very stressed out, or the finals here is a very, very challenging time for them. Another example might be, I've worked with someone that was an adult that sucked their thumb, and she said, I don't know why I'm sucking my thumb, but it was really this defense mechanism whenever there was some sort of stressful event happening, and this was a 35-year-old woman. So regression is going back to those developmental stages that you have previously mastered. It could be you mastered it a little bit ago, bedwetting is common in children that are, they might have experienced trauma, but it also can happen in adults. Then we have repression, not to be confused with the regression. Repression is when we're unconsciously, let me go back. It's when we're unconsciously, quote unquote, forgetting painful ideas or conflicts. And I have quote unquote forgetting because it doesn't mean we're consciously forgetting these things. The way that I like to think about it is you've kind of put it in a box way, way, way deep in your brain, and you don't need to retrieve that box. You've put it away for not to be thought of again. An example of this is an adult may not recall that their parent died in a car accident 10 years ago because they have pushed this event so far away in their unconscious. You might see repression happening a lot with people with like a lot of trauma. Veterans often use repression when they're asked about, being in combat. They might not be able to recall these events. And that's because subconsciously, unconsciously, they've pushed this way, way, way back in, so that they don't have to constantly have these feelings and these thoughts coming up. So that is repression. Sublimation. This one is seen as a positive defense mechanism. And this is when you might have a strong emotion or a negative feeling, unwanted feeling, and you redirect it into something positive, such as a safe and productive activity. The example here is someone has anger issues, so they have a lot of anger built up, and what they do to channel this is they take up boxing. So now instead of going and beating people up or being physically aggressive, they're using boxing as a way to get their anger out. It's kind of like an outlet for something. So some way that you're channeling some sort of anxiety or inner feelings that you're having. And we have a ton of ways that we use this. For example, some people really like running or working out to kind of channel that anxiety and channel that energy. Undoing. So undoing is taking back behavior that we have found as unacceptable or hurtful. And people do this all the time. And an example is you've insulted someone, and in order to undo this, you spend the next hour praising them, showering them in compliments, and kind of just undoing that negative harm or those negative statements that you made about people. Another example is, say you did something, you know, wrong, you hurt your spouse's feelings, so then you go out and you buy them dinner, or you cook them dinner, or you spend the next 3 hours just really doing everything for that person. You're trying to undo something that you know was unacceptable or hurtful to the person. So undoing is a very common thing, because, you know, we probably did not have the intention to hurt someone, so unconsciously we're trying to undo that to make them feel better. So those cover most of the big bucket defense mechanisms you will see. I always like to add additional resources because these are good for visual learners. Maybe you learn best by video or audio. So I've linked a YouTube clip on defense mechanisms. And then also if you go to Psychologist World and you look up defense mechanisms, there are 31 listed with different examples. I did not go over 31 today. So if you're like, you know, I really wanted to learn a little bit more, you definitely can go there and check them out. And defense mechanisms, like I said, they're definitely something that we need to go over and come up with examples for. And after this, we will hop into some practice questions so you can really see how they appear in test-like questions. And here is my contact info. I have actually, in addition to this, a 7-session series, very similar to this setup. I have the audio, I have PowerPoint, I have practice questions. And if you want to purchase more content or you're interested in looking further into this, my website is here and you can actually purchase directly on there and the material will be sent directly to you. This is what the website looks like. And the 7 sessions I offer are back to basics. That's if you're just getting started, you don't know where to start, you want to organize your studying and get ready to prepare for the exam. I have developmental theories that really goes into Erikson, Piaget, and Kohlberg. Macro and community practice, that goes into indirect practice, programs, policies, and how we as social workers are seen in the community. I have DSM-5 that goes over the major diagnoses that you will see and also provides case vignettes so you can test your knowledge. Substance abuse, it goes not only over the major drugs of choice, but it also goes over addiction theory a little bit. Therapy theories, this is for those that, it's good for the master's level, very good for the clinical level. It goes into CBT, DBT, short-term therapy, solution focus, and really gives examples of when it would be appropriate to use those theories. And then last, the code of ethics. This is going to be on any level licensing exam that you see, and I go over a quick synopsis of the code of ethics, but really dive into some ethical dilemmas that you might see, and the questions are all based around some really challenging ethics situations that might be encountered on the exam. So if you're interested in learning more, you can buy all 7 sessions for $80 or individual sessions for $15. So let's jump into our practice exam. So the way it will work is I'm going to read it and then talk through the questions, talk through the answer choices, and discuss why each question and answer choice is the correct answer. So number 1, a man has been having difficulties at work. When the wife inquires further about these problems, he gets upset and accuses her of having issues at work. The husband is most likely using the defense mechanism of reaction formation, projection, conversion, or displacement. So there are some that I can automatically get rid of right away. Reaction formation is expressing our actions as the opposite. That doesn't really make sense in this vignette, so we can get rid of that. Which leads us with projection, conversion, displacement. Conversion, remember, is a bodily response or some symptoms that you might see physically. There's nothing here that suggests that that would be correct, so we can get rid of conversion. Leads us to projection and displacement, which I told you can be very tricky. Displacement is putting your unwanted thoughts or feelings, displacing them onto an unrelated object or a person. That does not really make sense. It's not the best answer for this question. The correct answer would be projection, because the wife's asking about the man's difficulties at work, and he's projecting these difficulties onto her, suggesting she has issues at work. So the correct answer here, we can get rid of displacement, would be projection. He is projecting his feelings of not doing well at work onto her and suggesting she's not doing it at work. Number 2, Jessica was an aggressive child in elementary school who frequently got into trouble. In high school, she joined the track team and no longer displays aggression or gets into trouble at school. Jessica is most likely using the defense mechanism of reaction formation, sublimation, intellectualization, or displacement. We can automatically rule out reaction formation. She's not expressing anything as the opposite. Intellectualization, there's nothing that shows she really read about it or learned intellectual material on it. We can get rid of intellectualization, which leads us with sublimation or displacement. She's not displacing any negative feelings onto someone else or onto an event, so we can get rid of displacement. And that leaves us with sublimation. And remember that sublimation is when we are channeling any sort of unwanted or feelings that, of aggression, of anger, of stress onto something else that is productive. So she had a lot of aggression later on. She found track. Track is a good outlet for her. So she's channeling that aggression into track. She's no longer getting into trouble. So sublimation would be the best answer for this. Number 3, Eric is very dependent on his mom. She does many things for him, including washing and ironing his clothes and making him dinner. When asked about this by a friend, Eric becomes defensive and says his friend is a quote-unquote mama's boy. Eric is most likely using the defense mechanism of projection, denial, intellectualization, or displacement. He's not denying anything. Instead, he is projecting his thoughts of feeling dependent onto his friend by calling him a mama's boy. So we can get rid of off the bat denial. He's not denying that anything's happening. And intellectualization does not show that he's using any intellectual material or trying to learn more or anything specific. Once again, we're left with projection or displacement. Remember, projection is when we are putting our beliefs and our feelings and naming them as someone else's, whereas displacement is taking our anger, unwanted feelings, and channeling it towards someone else. The correct answer here is projection, because the clues that you can find for this is that Eric is dependent on his mom and she does a lot of things for him. And when approached by his friend, he says, well, you're a mama's boy. He's projecting those feelings that he has about being dependent on his mom, and maybe he self-identifies as a mama's boy, but is projecting it onto his friend. So projection is the correct answer here. Number 4, what is an example of regression? Someone who hasn't experienced trauma begins to act out towards his family through aggression. Someone who has been physically assaulted is not able to recount the attack in her therapy session. Someone who did not get a job they wanted begins crying and pouting and cannot be consoled. Someone who was embezzling money claims that he was set up and denies having been involved. What is an example of regression? Remember, regression is when we revert back to past developmental stages. So you're going to want to see someone that was functioning normally, and then they're really behaving in very immature or childlike ways. So A is out. Acting out in aggression is not an example of regression. Someone who has been physically assaulted is not able to recount the attack in her therapy session. That is not regression. That would be repression. Oh, let's make this red. That's not the correct answer. B is not the correct answer. C, someone who did not get a job they wanted begins crying and pouting and cannot be consoled. To me, that would suggest that someone has probably reverted back, because it's generally not the most common response for an adult to start crying, pouting, and cannot be consoled because they did not get a job they wanted. But we do want to make sure we read D before ruling it out. Someone who was embezzling money claims that he was set up and denies having been involved. That would be denial, so that can be ruled out, which leads us to C. Someone who did not get a job they wanted begins crying and pouting and cannot be consoled. They're really reverting back to that. That would be a very common response for maybe a child who did not get something they wanted, but maybe a defense mechanism for an adult to cope. So C is the correct answer. Number 5, a CEO of a major corporation was bullied as a child. He was frequently manipulated and made fun of by his peers. In the workplace, he laughs at his employees in meetings and pressures them into completing tasks for him. This is an example of what? Displacement, identification with aggressor, reaction formation, or introjection. So we can start to rule some out. Reaction formation is acting out opposite of the way you're feeling. That does not make sense. Introjection is taking the beliefs or values of someone and using them as your own. That does not make sense either. Which leaves us with displacement or identification with aggressor. And both of these could potentially make sense, but one is the better answer, and it shows in the question stem. So here it says he was bullied, he was manipulated and made fun of. And then it says now in his workplace, he laughs at employees and pressures them into completing things. So the best answer here would be identification with aggressor. Something happened to this person, he was bullied, he was manipulated, he was made fun of, and now as an adult, he's doing the same things, he's imitating that behavior. So it would be identification with aggressor. We can rule out displacement. And our last one. Anna's husband dies and she continues to set a place for him at the dinner table. This is an example of dissociation, denial, repression, or redirection. So here, she's setting a place for him. This would, to me, would signal that she has not accepted or is not acknowledging that something happened. The husband has passed away, but still she continues to set a place at the dinner table for him. The correct answer for this would be denial. She's denying that the death of her husband happened by still including him or trying to include him in family dinners or something like that. She's not dissociating. She's not breaking off from reality. So we can get rid of that. She's not repressing. And she's not redirecting. So the best answer here would be denial. She's denying that her husband has died, acting as if it never happened. This is very common, and it's very, very common like shortly after a traumatic event has occurred. So, you know, you sometimes see people making a lunch for their lost loved one. They just are denying that person has come to pass. So very, very common in the grief stages. But those were some sample questions, and hopefully it was helpful for you to test your knowledge. Once again, thank you for tuning in. I hope this was a useful resource for you. If you would like to learn more or see some of more of my content, you may go to this website, gumroad.com/ASWB test prep. And you can purchase directly on the site, and it will be secure payment and emailed directly to your inbox. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you